to do, across, in essence, sort of relationship building across academia, so across disciplines, across sectors, so working into business, government, civil society, Indigenous organizations. And I think the lecture today that focuses on citizen science is just a wonderful illustration of this. Our strategic plan has 3 key focus areas: public trust in expertise and expert-based decision-making. Again, I think you're going to hear a little bit about that today in the topic of citizen science. The second area of focus for us is supporting co-production when it comes to the development of public policies. So government working alongside with those outside of government, whether it's academia, civil society, industry, in terms of identifying policy approaches that will address grand challenges. And then the final area of focus for us is weaving together technological and social innovation. So we're certainly going to, again, be hearing about that today. So this event for us is really, we're very excited about this session today. We, on an annual basis, have a scholar who visits us from the United States through the Canada-United States Fulbright Visiting Research Chair program. Our research chair is focused on science and society. This year's visiting scholar is Dr. Aleta Quinn, who you will hear from in a moment. She joins us from the University of Idaho, where she is a professor in the Department of Politics and Philosophy. We are very honored to have with us today Dr. Michael Hawes, the President and CEO of the Foundation for Educational Exchange between Canada and the United States, aka Fulbright Canada. For those who don't know Dr. Hawes, he is an accomplished scholar in his own right with expertise in foreign policy, political culture, international economic relations, Canadian foreign policy. Over and above the work that you do at Fulbright Canada, he maintains an active research program. He's publishing books. I don't know how you do it, Michael, but we're very grateful that you do. Fulbright Canada has been a close friend at the University of Ottawa. We've always been so grateful for your support. So, Michael, I'm going to give the floor to you to say a few words.
I'll move here.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Monica. And indeed, the university is a very close friend of Fulbright Canada's. And as you all may know, Ottawa is an Algonquin Anishinaabe word for welcome. So I always feel welcome when I'm at the University of Ottawa. And frankly, I've found that the people who come that we bring here always feel welcome at the University of Ottawa. It has been a unbelievably persistent and consistent response from visitors that this is a place that is welcoming, kind, and productive and valuable. So, yeah, thrilled that you're here. You weren't at orientation, so this is our first meeting. The Fulbright program has been around since 1946. We have over 300,000 alumni around the world. We support all varieties of research. We support undergraduate students, graduate students, scholars. We do projects and programs that are associated with big contemporary challenges. We too are ambitious. We look for the best and brightest from every part of the academic community and indeed from the community more broadly. Some of our most recent activities have focused on the shift in the nature of work. So we've started a new Fulbright Canada program on entrepreneurship. We're announcing, and I haven't had a chance to speak to Monica about this yet, but I will be seeking her advice. A new program on energy security and sustainability, a big gift from an outgoing board member. So we'll be looking to support people who are working in that area. As no one in this room knows better than Monica, the challenge between securing energy and having a sustainable energy environment and having a socially impactful environment is a big challenge. So we're doing what we can in our own modest way. We operate in 166 countries around the world. We do, in addition to the Canada-US piece, we're involved in the Arctic project, where we have scholars in all 8 Arctic Council countries. We have collective arrangements with our colleagues in Mexico. And I personally have been spending a lot of time in Morocco lately, working with the king and that group, trying to develop their capacity and their leadership in Northwest Africa. I say that here at the University of Ottawa because you may or may not know this, but you have the largest number of Moroccan students in Canada.
And employees.
In fact, the last time I was there was just a few months ago. I was at Mohammed VI and in Marrakesh and in Casa and Rabat. So I'm a big fan of Morocco. Look, what we're here for today, though, is Aleta for this program on citizen and community science. Dr. Aleta Quinn is I'm just a classic academic. I read everything that's the Moscow thing, you know. I can't think of a person better suited to address this topic. For a relatively early career scholar, her background is phenomenal. Pittsburgh, Caltech, Notre Dame, and currently Idaho, a very prolific scholar, a person who somehow manages to live at the intersection between philosophy, history, politics, and biology. She is, I gather, an amateur herpetologist, which is a word I have never heard of until early this morning.
You may hear it again in a moment.
There you go. Most importantly, and this is a reflection of my own background combined with my organization, what we care about, like Monica said, is innovation, integrity, excellence, inclusion, diversity, and all of that only happens when people are genuinely curious, genuinely open to new ideas, and genuinely interested in including other people in those ideas and that work. And honestly, what I've learned in my research this morning is that is Dr. Aleta Quinn. So please.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Michael. We'll pass it over to Aleta in a moment, but I did want to also just take a moment to introduce our moderator for today. One of the, as I mentioned earlier, one of the modus operandi of the Institute is cross-disciplinary fertilization. And so I think our choice of moderator for today reflects that. We also are very keen to support early career researchers, the next generation of leaders in the science society policy space. So wanted to just introduce to you as well, Dr. Jennie Day. She holds a prestigious MITAX Accelerator postdoctoral fellowship here at the University of Ottawa. She's working in a research lab of one of our core members, Dr. Jason Miller. The lab is called the Canadian Robotics and Artificial Intelligence Ethical Design Lab, otherwise known as CRADLE, very smart. And she's also affiliated with the University of Ottawa Centre for Law, Technology, and Society. So her work, and I think there's some really interesting synergies here. Her work explores the visions of technology held by engineers who are developing AI-assisted aging-in-place technologies for older adults. So you can say, well, what are the connections here? But certainly, with her work, her aim is to really try to help them to constructively shape ethical design, development, and deployment of these technologies in a practice that involves creation of bottom-up ethical frameworks. So, the involvement of citizens, values-based, what she refers to as ethical engineering design requirements. So we're very fortunate to have her with us here today. Thank you, Jennie. Now, am I turning it over to you or to Aleta? I know you guys had done a little bit of setting things up originally. Do I turn it to you or are we heading over to Aleta now?
I'll take it.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Monica. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you everybody for coming. Today we are going to hear from Aleta, but I'll just let you know how it's going to run. So we're going to hear from Aleta for about 30 minutes, and then we'll take the rest of the hour for questions and discussions. So we have some participants online, so welcome. If you guys have any questions as Aleta is presenting, please add them to the chat and we will raise them when the discussion's over, and then everybody in the room will take a discussion after Aleta is finished her presentation. So without further ado, Aleta, please take it away.
Thank you. And thank you so much for that very kind introduction. I really appreciate that a lot. Yeah, so I'm a philosopher of science, to the extent that I have a home discipline anymore. And what that means is that I ask questions about how science works with a focus on knowledge questions. So how are scientific claims and methods justified? What patterns of scientific inference are there? What logics of reasoning are operative? And sometimes we also ask questions about scientific concepts. So that's the type of approach I tend to take. And I became interested in citizen science. Now, I'm not going to tell you about all citizen science. I'm not going to even make a claim that this is typical citizen science. I am going to tell you about the examples that I have the most familiarity with. And I will begin my journey in Southern California. So I had just moved out to Los Angeles and I wanted to see a salamander, which I had never done before, but I'd heard when I was at the Smithsonian that there were people that would do this. And it's like, okay, I would like to see one. So I reached out to an academic scientist and he told me a little bit about some research questions that he and some other academic scientists had. He also told me that the thing about these salamander species is they breathe through their skin, so they have to stay wet. It doesn't rain a lot in Los Angeles, except recently. So in typical years, the salamanders will be underground for most of the time, and there's this very limited amount of time when you can go see them. So they said, let's get together. And also, there's this person, he is not professionally employed as a scientist, but we can go to his spots and he will show us how to find salamanders. And we did. And so we found many salamanders, Batrachuses, and found indeed that the two species that are present there have somewhat different habitat preferences, which has implications in terms of their evolutionary dynamics, but also potentially for conservation. And it was a blast. I had a great time. And that was the first time I'd looked for salamanders, and I've sort of been doing it ever since. Now, we also happened to find this organism that day. It is a Brahminy blind snake, which is an invasive species. It's a clonal lineage. They're all female. They just reproduce parthenogenetically. They don't have to mate in order to reproduce. And they're invasive partly because of that, because it's pretty easy for them to spread around. And it's really tough to get rid of them once they become established. And they spread in like the root balls. If you buy an ornamental plant or something, there might be one of those in there. So this was one of the first observations in the Los Angeles area of that particular species. So when you're talking about an invasive snake or lizard, they're notorious for being difficult to control once the population is established. So early detection and rapid response are keys. So for example, this one, these are observations of an invasive lizard from a few years back. And once these things started cropping up, some people from the Los Angeles Museum, actually some of the folks I was with that day, they organized people, community members, and set up a series of systematic surveys. And there were trainings and there were trapping. And so they trapped these lizards, dozens and dozens of them over the course of the first two field seasons. And then there were no more lizards. And they've kept up the surveys, but it appears the population is no longer there, which is actually a pretty huge success story for invasive squamates. Okay, so I've been talking about some of the various benefits. The image that I had from the previous slide was taken from this platform, which is inaturalist.org. And it's what it is if you have a cell phone or a camera, you can go outside, take a picture of an organism. You can use the app or the web browser. You can use the metadata from your phone, or you can put the location yourself, and there's various options that you can toggle. And then it'll suggest an identification to the species level. You can agree with that or put something else. And if you post it, what'll happen is if your photo is reasonably okay, folks who use this platform will come along and they'll either confirm the identification or they'll suggest a different one, or they might get into a discussion about it. They might get into an argument about it, might get into an argument about the taxonomy of the species. But there's a lot of users. There's 3 million people roughly using this platform, have used it at least once as of when I took the screen grab over the weekend. There's about 350,000 people providing identifications, and we're up to over 170 million observations at this point. This is not even the largest platform like this. eBird has got to be over probably 2 billion at this point, I would think. But it is to show the scope of the data is massive. And so most of the folks who are contributing this data are not themselves professionally employed as scientists, but academic scientists have used this data for all sorts of purposes. Indeed, questions which couldn't even sort of be asked before can be enabled with this scale of data. Things like ecology, behaviors, morphology, and also you can study the spread of invasives, and you can look at things like climate change by looking at how occurrence in time and space changes over time, which indeed one of my citizen scientist colleagues told me, like, look, you need to be thinking about this in terms of what is this going to be like 50 years from now? Because at that point, the type of question you might be able to ask, we maybe can't even imagine right now. So this has enormous power. Just to further demonstrate the increase in discussions about citizen science, I just did a Google Scholar search of citations of these terms year by year, and I plotted it out. And so it's rapidly on the rise. Now, at this point, I'll also mention, in my journey reading into the various literatures of history and philosophy, and then sociology and science and technology studies and environmental studies, and trying to put together a conversation across disciplinary gulfs, I've noted that there are some distinctions in how these terms are used. There is some discussion as to which things refer to what, how to make distinctions, what taxonomies of these terms to use, in which are more preferable. I'm going with citizen science today because most of the cases that I'll be talking about, the people involved refer to themselves as citizen scientists. Okay, so that brings me here. I looked into the literature of philosophers publishing on citizen science, and I found that Eliot and Rosenberg had published a paper, Philosophical Foundations for Citizen Science. So it's a great place to start. Okay, see what has been said. And what they did is they had a workshop with professionally employed scientists and also people who had been engaged in citizen science projects. And they had discussions. Among those discussions, they expressed concerns, either concerns that they had about citizen science or that had been directed at them or that they had heard. And Eliot and Rosenberg grouped that into 3 themes that had emerged. I'm only going to talk about the third one today, which is that citizen science is advocacy, it's not science. So the concern in general is that citizen science may be lacking certain features of objectivity that we normally think of as science as having, that there might be a problematic role of values pervading citizen science projects in particular cases, but also this statement is being uttered sort of generally, that this set of phenomena potentially have a general problem. So I said, all right, I'll start there, and I'll start by thinking about what philosophers have said about objectivity. So how does that apply to the case of citizen science, or to the cases that I've been concerned with? So rough start, Heather Douglas has analyzed the concept of objectivity. Actually, she argues there's 8 different senses that are not reducible to each other. It's a great paper, but she says what is generally in common about claims of objectivity is that to say something is objective is to say, I trust it, and so should you. So you could think in terms of reliability. This is just to clarify, I'm not talking about, is there an objectively real external world? It's not a metaphysical question. It's a question concerned with knowledge. And in Carrie Koskinen has analyzed objectivity. She puts it, we're talking about strategies to avoid or mitigate epistemic risk. Epistemic just means having to do with knowledge. So she's analyzing strategies, ways to avoid being wrong about stuff, about knowledge claims. And the approach I thought to take was one rooted in social epistemology, which is a field or subfield that considers that when you make claims and arguments about what knowledge is and how it's justified, it is necessary to consider social processes and social institutions. And so Helen Longino analyzed science as a social process. Whatever else it is, science is social. It involves humans and social interactions. And at that time, there had been a concern that potentially the fact that there's a human element in science makes it less rational than would be ideal if we were all emotionless robots. But actually, she argued the fact that science is social is not a threat to its rationality. As a matter of fact, she argued, to a large extent, scientific objectivity can emerge as a result of particular social processes within scientific communities. And in particular, the critical processes are to do with criticism. The rough idea is that you have a scientific community with individual scientists, each of whom has somewhat different background assumptions. That among those background assumptions, there may be biases. There may be biases that might affect the way that they're perceiving the evidence, or the way they're reasoning about the evidence, or the way that they're connecting a theory to observations in interesting ways, but potentially problematic ways if you have idiosyncratic assumptions or biases. Now, if you have a group of people and they have somewhat different background assumptions, then what can happen over time is through a process of dialogue and criticism, the pernicious influence of the individual biases can be mitigated, it can be weeded out. So science is a team process of eliminating problematic assumptions. And I won't go too much into the details, but just to state that there are details of this model, that she identifies 4 different criteria that we can use to analyze how well functioning a community is. Okay? So this is objectivity in degrees, right? She analyzes a lot of cases where it goes wrong. And she suggests that we can think about, for effective criticism to be happening, you need some kind of shared agreement about what even is an appropriate criticism to make. You need avenues, places where people can make criticisms and have it be uptaken. So mainly peer-reviewed journals at conferences. There needs to be some awareness that even if it's a lowly graduate student or undergraduate even who's making the criticism, the quality of the argument should be considered. Okay, so there's a degree of equal intellectual authority, but she recognizes that social standings matter and the way criticisms will be heard will differ, and also that there's a role for expertise. So this criterion is somewhat complex. And then finally, it just has to be the case that criticism gets uptaken at a communal level. So if one scientist makes a mistake, another scientist corrects it, and the original scientist is like, you're right, and he corrects it and all keeps the work, that's great. But if the other scientists all keep citing the original paper, you do not have communal uptake of criticism. Okay, so that's the model. What is citizen science? So at first I was thinking in terms of, the attempts to put a definition typically are things like the participation of non-professional scientists in scientific research, which draws kind of a sharp distinction there. And so I'm thinking here we have folks within the scientific community, and then we have some people who are external to that community attempting to launch things into the scientific community, whether that's data or potentially criticism. And in this way of thinking about things, what's going to happen is it's likely going to be up to individual or subset of scientists to facilitate the transmission of things into the scientific community, at which point the critical dialogue can happen within the scientific community if the input is successful. So whilst I started thinking in that way, the longer I went to meetings of the Wildlife Society and Partners in Amphibians and Reptile Conservation. In some of these spaces, number one, I started to lose track of who exactly was a scientist and who counts and what things make that determination, both in terms of professions that are more or less science-y, science adjacent, but also in terms of just, it was the same people showing up at these meetings at the Wildlife Society and Partners in Amphibians and Reptile Conservation. And so I started thinking in terms of the kind of extended model, extended community of science, folks in this kind of liminal zone who are to some degree scientists and to some degree not. And then that helped me think about, okay, well, maybe on this model, you'll have some inputs that will be more successful because these folks are already sort of partially in this liminal zone. This also incidentally helped me realize, like, okay, if folks who are not fully integrated into the core academic science community might contribute criticisms, they can do so and they can generate scientific objectivity within that community, even though they themselves don't have to say, I am a fully objective person, because it's a communal process that we're talking about here. And that made sense to me. Made sense when I heard somebody who is not a professional scientist say, hey, they published that paper. There was this one species, there was a species of snake that the scientists split into two different species. They now think there's two different ones there. But there's this population in this one area that I looked in the paper, they didn't sample any specimens from that population. I've been to that area, I've seen those snakes. They look exactly like they're intermediate between the two putative species. So that, to me, sure looks like there's gene flow there. And I bet if you took some genes and reran the structurama analysis, you would get a different subdivision of species. And I said, that sounds like a good criticism to me. And I said, I've heard that from folks who are in the core scientific community, but I also heard that from people who are not. And I became interested. So at this point, just again, waving that there are details, I was trying to figure out how would these processes be instantiated given this somewhat more complicated model of a scientific community. But then I remembered something I should have remembered all along. And I had read in the literature that this is common, that there's a disparity, a different distribution of labor in a lot of citizen science projects, where you have a small number of people contributing a huge amount of the labor. And so I just went to iNaturalist and I just picked snakes. There's 1 million snake observations on the platform, roughly at the time that I looked. They were provided by 250,000 people who contributed at least one snake observation. But I found that 2% of the users were responsible for fully 20% of the data. Furthermore, that 0.05% of the users were alone responsible for 10% of the data. And the top 10 contributors had produced 2% of all those 1 million observations in the world. And so I said, well, who are these people?
Excellent question.
I looked and I was like, oh, I know that person, and I know that person, and I know that person. This is just in the top 10. I'm kind of proud, actually. But I knew these people because they're herpers. So herping is a hobby. It's like birding, but with amphibians and reptiles. And I've been herping as potty for some years, and so I've gotten to know some of these folks. And I recognized them, and I realized that's a community, actually. Herping is a community. They refer to themselves as a community. We refer to ourselves as a community. And the community involves knowledge practices. It's an epistemic community. Okay, so I learned how to herp from these folks. I learned things about how to search, what are the appropriate ethical search methods, when to search, which species you can get at what times, what are the appropriate methods for finding which ones, also what information I should not share with other people. And so as I thought about this, like, yeah, this is an epistemic community, which means we could apply these criteria to that community and see how well functioning is criticism within the hobby herping community. And there's definitely criticism in the hobby herping community. But the criteria are instantiated much differently, right? There's not peer-reviewed journals, but there's field herp forum. There's the message boards on iNaturalist. There's other groups. There are meetings. There are bioblitzes. There are gatherings. There are shared standards. These have evolved over time. There's a system of reputation building and sharing. Equal authority in the sense that if you can produce the snake, you can produce the snake. Right? You did it. It's equal authority, but the tempered reputation of the trustworthiness of claims. So I was thinking about it that way. So there's going to be some extent then to which if folks are operating in a hobby community and they attempt to interact with a professional science community, some of their claims might already have been tempered by objectivity producing practice. Okay. So I realized I have to think about the models of objectivity in terms of the intersections of communities. I've drawn these the same size. That was random. I don't intend to mean anything by that. I also realized the folks, some of the folks that I was seeing over and over again were essentially kind of like an intermediate community that has been forming up. A subset of the hobby community was interested in interacting with the scientific community, and a subset of the scientific community was interested in interacting, and they got to know each other over time over these sort of stable institutional platforms like the Wildlife Society meetings, like iNaturalist, like the Field Herp Forum. And so this remark, this is a citizen science project led by professional naturalists, was overheard at a meeting of partners in amphibian and reptile conservation. And I find it endlessly fascinating. But okay. I then remembered the stories that I'd been told about the North American Field Herping Association. So once upon a time, there were some hobby herpers who had some concerns about reports coming out of the agency scientists having to do with certain populations of herps, and were they in decline? What were the causes of decline? And the herpers had some concerns that they disagreed with some of the claims. They didn't think them likely. And but they also wanted to help them because they recognized a lot of agency scientists can be underfunded and also have unstable funding that might change with political situations. So they wanted to help, but they also wanted to be heard. But if they were to go to the scientists and say, I'm a person who likes to drive around at night looking for snakes, and I can tell you some things, probably not likely to get taken very seriously. So they built a database. This was actually before iNaturalist, around the same time, but certainly before it was popular. So they built a database. They made various decisions about what sorts of data can be entered, who can see the data, what are the options for that, what do we do about missing data, are we going to encode mechanisms for checking the quality of the data, we're going to do that by reputation or some other way. And they made all sorts of choices, and they built up this data set. And yes, before probably in about a month, I'm going to fill in multiple counties that are currently missing.
Biggest red.
I have to get friends. That's one is number of contributors and other ones I could have chosen. So if friends want to come with me, then.
Well, you got about the right amount of people.
And so they put together the database, and indeed they were heard. So the original agency scientists actually launched into a series of collaborations and publications with some of the project organizers of the North American Field Herping Association project. And many other agencies across the US have requested data from this database and platform. So I would claim, one more slide, that fits my sort of philosophical abstract model of what may be going on with the transmission of criticism and construction of intermediate communities. This slide is just to remind me to suggest that it's not just my one weird case. but there's been analysis of other cases of citizen science that share many of the same features. And so that gets me to my conclusions, which are just that when thinking about citizen science, we need to make sort of finer distinctions than just scientists versus non-scientists. And in particular, we can think about people in terms of the roles that they have in projects. So some taxonomies of citizen science, they look at how involved are the citizens, which that's useful for some things. But thinking in terms of what are the roles, the fact that it was a non-professional scientist who was our leader that day, for example, can bring out other interesting features to learn about citizen science. And in particular, to recognize that folks have expertises that are connected to various epistemic communities. So Alan Irwin's monograph, I think it was 1995 on citizen science, talked a lot about expertises. He seemed to have in mind like local expertises, the knowledge that one would have by virtue of living and operating in a particular place over a period of time. But now in this story that I've told, you have these institutional platforms that are located either on the internet or potentially through societies that can have different geographic spaces. And so thinking now, in this case of an epistemic community, is one that's not tied to a particular geographic location. I would also argue that objectivity can be instantiated in different degrees, in different ways, within multiple epistemic communities, and that the communications across communities can promote objectivity within either community or as the shared product. And then the final thing I'll say is last week I read a fantastic paper by Gabrielle Contessa, who's over at Carleton, who made very similar argument, but about science communication. As I was talking about citizen science and the production of knowledge, he was interested in how folks in various communities receive science communications and perceive them, and arguing that basically our models of science communication have to recognize individuals as members of various communities of knowledge transmission. Okay. The last thing I'll say is thanks. And so I'd like to thank Fulbright Canada and also my institutional hosts at Ottawa. And I thank Sam Sweet, who is an academic professional scientist who sort of introduced me to this universe. And then Jonathan and Brian, who taught me how to herp. And thank you for coming.
Thank you, Aleta. That was fascinating. Do we have any questions in the room? We can also
on Zoom, do we have any questions there? Feel free to put yourself into the chat, the questions into the chat if you have any.
If we don't have any questions in the room quite yet, I have a question that it's not directly related to your specific project, but kind of zooming out and thinking about citizen science as kind of a broader practice in society. In one way, it's kind of a Janus-based thing I see. In one way, it's wonderful to break down some of the ivory tower nature of science and not just let it be relegated to the people who have PhDs. But on the other side of the coin, we've seen a movement specifically in the global north, in the UK, the US, and Canada increasingly to push back against experts and expertise. And I wondered, and that kind of movement is of certain political, often on the right-hand side of the spectrum, with interests being funded from different actors, and it kind of leads to misinformation and disinformation. It's embroiled in that whole dimension of society. I wonder, have you, based on your involvement in a really productive area of citizen science, do you have any thoughts about how these two sides of the coin interact?
Yes. Okay, there's a lot there.
Yes, there is, yeah.
So the first thing, since I just mentioned Irwin's monograph, one striking feature of that was he argued very heavily that citizen science is about a fundamental transformation of the relationship between science and society as a whole. On the other hand, when I was reading in the environmental sciences literatures and speaking with professionally employed academic scientists, sometimes it seems more like, well, there's science, and like sometimes these other people can be involved. And ideally, we would have cell phones with legs, but they're people, so shouldn't jest. But point being, thinking of citizen science in terms of provision of data versus a transformation, and there is definitely a tension there. And it seems to be sort of different across different literatures. The positive cases I've been involved with, I told this very positive story. I am aware that there are weird communities with people making really weird claims and things that look like epistemic communities but aren't. Okay, so I'm thinking, unfortunately, of a very particular case of an online community that was devoted to solving a murder that happened in my hometown, and they went off the rails into aliens and drug smuggling, and they started identifying individual people in my town who, yeah, anyway, it was a mess. So I perceive that as what it is it looks superficially like a community of inquiry. It looks superficially like it's an epistemic community of people trying to figure things out and share information, but that is really not what's going on. They're not actually legitimately pursuing knowledge claims. Now, I'm not sure exactly how to analyze those distinctions and identify those cases. Fortunately, I have a colleague who's working on that,
Nice.
who is more grounded in social epistemology in particular. So I think it's possible that that will be helpful for making those distinctions. Yeah. And also just the breakdown of epistemic communities over time is another thing that can happen that she's working on.
Thank you.
Sorry, just rolling on a little further beyond that, it seems like this may be an artifact of the social media that have such a prevalence and allowing a voice to people who may not be in a position to have that, yes, you could say, the feedback mechanism from a community who are in knowledge.
Yes, yeah, so in that case, the putative epistemic community formed like overnight on a Facebook group, right? And there's no sense in which you can talk about the expertises associated with that group. Yeah.
Oh, I think you had a question. Go ahead.
First of all, there's gonna be lots of fun things you're gonna find in Ottawa, and the green space is really close by, so that's good. So once you get weather like this week, it'll start. I guess I'm curious, like, do we know, are there studies on the science, the civic and science community, like, who are these people and who aren't they? Are there parts of our diverse communities that are kind of really in there and others who are not interested, or is it very broad? And I guess the other part would be, is there any studies that involve kind of Indigenous communities and their knowledge keepers in this space?
Yeah, so there's a lot there, and I am often asked systems, and I'm not competent to make that comparison. So all I can say is that I recognize some similarities to things I've said, and I recognize many important differences. That's where I'm at the moment. First thing I thought of the first half of your question was, first of all, since nobody agrees what the term citizen science actually specifically means, it's difficult to figure out who folks are. But that being said, there are definitely, there's work being done on trying to track over time who tends to become involved in projects. What are the outcomes? What are the educational outcomes? Are there changes in attitudes? I have also, it has been pointed out to me and emphasized that in a case like this, these are folks who have the time and resources to go around looking for stuff and have that amount of time. And that geographically, what's going to happen is people who have time and resources will be conducting more citizen science in cases of this type. And that's the extent that there's benefits to be had from their research projects. They'll be concentrated in relatively more wealthy areas. And apparently this is happening in Boise. was asked this question there. So yes, very important questions that folks are working on.
Okay. So first of all, Dr. Day, that was the clearest and most delicate description of our current political environment that I've heard in some time. My question follows along those lines, sort of. And really the question is, what is the motivation of citizen scientists? What Dr. Day was talking about were people who are at best just plain old self-interested, at worst hyper narcissistic. And their motivations are not good ones. It seems like the group you're talking about here are persons who are genuinely curious. I really want that to be the answer to my question.
Yeah. I will also mention I recently learned that a couple of friends of mine fell into conspiracy theory land. So I would say sometimes the motivation is good, but they fall victim to the psychology of conspiracy theories. And I think a lot of folks like that were speculating who the murderer was because it's fun.
No, but I mean,
Yeah, so my folks,
you're
okay, why, Jonathan, why do you hurt? Because they're there. No, he would say that there's an inherent interest in finding salamander. He's a salamander person. Brian's more of a snake person. They are inherently interested. They really do want to contribute. Okay. They do have, some skepticism of science, but their ultimate motivation, they want to help scientists do a better job. They want to help the herps. They want to help preserve herp habitat. And they also, Brian was the past president of the North American Field Herping Association, and he has expressed to me that he explicitly wanted to link the scientific community, the hobby herping community, and other interested people in the general public, particularly people who might not have the resources to get into herpetology as a discipline or a field of study, but were potentially interested in reptiles, amphibians. The first time that you ever hold a snake, it's a transformative moment.
I'm gonna have to take your word for that.
I have been present on 14 such occasions.
Yeah.
And with some folks, it's like, other folks, it's like transformative and people become inherently interested. And so the curiosity, I would agree, is the answer in the case of these folks. Yeah, there is also empirical research on that. With the particular projects, they'll ask participants, like, why did you get into it? And you get a range of responses from wanting to help to inherent interest to it seemed fun to do.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you have any other questions in the room?
Is this time? Yes, there is. Thank you so much for this presentation.
Speaking my language as a philosopher of science, but also someone who loves snakes, but knows nothing about them either. Yeah. And so I'm sorry, I have too many thoughts to really form something very coherent. But what I've been thinking is my work is about the way that claims to objective science turn into harmful tools for, say, the law or the carceral state or things like that. And I'm thinking of citizen science after your presentation as a way of disrupting those, like the supremacy of science in a way, and not in a conspiratorial way, but in the way that as we're in groups, we can talk the same language and we skirt over the details on the ground. And so I can see citizen science as being a direct path into what's actually happening on the ground, if you know what I mean. As you say, these people have time in a way that often working scientists do not, but are also not listened to often, as you said. So have you noticed a way that the scientific community can provide more access to citizen scientists to come into and help push where we all think we already know? If you understand that question, it was clear enough.
I think so. And it's a huge question. And I love that. So I will answer the smallest part of it, which is, are there ways that we can promote the facilitation? So I think of things like the Master Naturalist program. And there are various sort of certifications or credentialing processes which are being set up. As well, Greg Polly, who was involved in the invasive lizard case at the Los Angeles Museum, he has published on how we should change how we think about authorship. We need to find a space for cases where there's significant contributions from citizen scientists. And, you know, these folks have been cited as like scientific authors, but there needs to be more sort of options and ways of recognizing in that way.
Awesome, yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm. That's excellent, thank you.
Okay, well, it's 12:58, which is excellent timing. So thank you so much, Aleta, for sharing your research with us. It was genuinely so interesting. I leave with full head full of buzzing thoughts, just like Kate. Thank you to the ISSP for hosting this event, and thank you to Monica, Yasmina, and the rest of the team for pulling it all together. And thank you to everybody here online and in person for joining us and having this discussion today. So thank you. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
I would just hop in very quickly as ISSP comes. Please stay tuned with our next event next month. We have the Bromley Memorial Conference, and we have the honor to have Dr. Rémi Quirion with us next month and year. And it's an annual conference organized with George Washington University. And so yeah, stay tuned. You're going to hear from us very soon. Yeah, thank you so much once again, Aleta, and thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. That sounds